Hi, my name is Armin Briegel. You probably know my weblog, Scripting OS 10. Today, I want to talk about the Encyclopedia of macOS Automation. Behind this admittedly pretentious title is the idea that I want to talk about all the different options that Mac admins and DevOps engineers and developers have for automating workflows on macOS. I've talked about this since about 2017, and the last time I did an update of this was 2019, and a lot has happened since then. So I wanted to check in now. This list that I did in 2019 of the things that I think you should kind of at least be aware of regarding automation on macOS. How well does that hold up for 2022? And yeah, let's dive into this. Back then, I identified shell scripting, particularly Bash, Python, Applescript, and Swift as tools that you don't necessarily need to master. I think it's impossible for everybody to master all of these tools, and I don't want to blame anyone or guilt anyone into feeling this is bad if you don't, but at least be aware of. Let's start with Python. You probably have heard there's been quite some upheaval around Python. Back in 2019, in the macOS beta release notes, we got this line that scripting language runtimes such as Python, Ruby, and Perl would be included in future macOS, especially Python 2.7 because it was end-of-lifed by the Python organization. Apple didn't have much choice in there. So it was fairly obvious that this would be the first target. So in 2019, in the 10.15 beta, the deprecation was announced. And it got this command line warning that it will be deprecated, removed, use something else if you used it from the command line. Perl and Ruby got the same command line warning, by the way. Then nothing much happened in Big Sur until in the 12 beta, we got this dialog. Every time you invoked, or a process invoked, even an app invoked Python 2 in the background, there was a user-facing dialog saying, you really need to update this, this will break. And hopefully that guilted and shamed the developers into fixing it, because, somewhat surprisingly, in a mid-year update in 12.3 in the beta, the runtime for Python 2 was removed completely. And in the release, it was gone. So you can say, well, we had 2 years, 9 months. We had plenty of warning, you should have fixed this. And then we got the warning in the 12 beta, which was more serious. You really should have fixed this. And there is definitely some truth to that. It shouldn't be a surprise. But you can also argue that the actual date of the removal wasn't announced until 2 months before in the 12.3 beta, which kind of short notice. So Python is gone, Perl and Ruby remain, but their clock is ticking. There's still some dependencies on Perl and Ruby in macOS. Apple doesn't really have this deadline ahead of them because Python 2 was end-of-life, and Perl and Ruby are not yet end-of-life. As a side note, PHP was also removed in macOS 12 with much less fanfare and drama, but it affected some people here as well. So Apple is serious about removing these runtimes from the OS for various good reasons. So what are the alternatives? Well, Apple recommends using Python 3, and they're kind of implying to use userbin Python 3, which exists on the system, but it's just the shim that plugs into the Python 3 that comes with Xcode or the developer command line tools. That means if you try to run this on a system that doesn't have Xcode or the developer command line tools installed, you will get this dialog, which if you want to automate stuff in the background as a system administrator, it's not a good thing. You don't want this dialog popping up in front of the user when you do something. So either you have to manage Xcode or the developer tools on all the system, which has a lot of downsides, or you have to provide your own Python, which is actually what Apple recommended in the original release note. You can use the standard Python 3 installer, which works fine, but it doesn't come with many or any modules that are interesting for most Mac admins. One of the most interesting things why Mac admins like using Python is the Python Objective-C bridge. There is a way to build your own relocatable Python with modules that Greg Nagel has documented, and you can use that. Or you can leverage the work that others have done. There's a MacAdmins Managed Python that comes with a pretty good set of standard modules that uses the relocatable Python that you can just download and install. And that's what I do. That's the easiest solution. Least work with the most effect, I think. So that's about Python. Python may be gone from the system, but I don't think it's gone from the options of what you should be using for automation. It's still a very powerful, useful choice. Next, I want to talk about Applescript and its related technologies, Automator and shortcuts. Now, Applescript is very deep in macOS, and even though it hasn't been updated very much over the past few years, you might say it feels neglected. It is so deeply integrated with the operating system that I don't think Apple is planning to yank it or could yank it if they wanted to. Its strength is inter-application communication. You want to move data from one application to another. Its strength and its downside is it depends on how well a third-party developer implements the Applescript dictionary. And this includes Apple as an application developer, because modern Apple applications leave a lot to be desired sometimes with regards to Applescript automation. It's kind of a sad state with modern Apple apps. One thing that is very interesting with Applescript, I mentioned earlier that MacAdmins like Python because of the Python Objective-C bridge that came together with Python 2 on macOS, that allows us to use the Objective-C frameworks and the system frameworks to get data out of the system that you can't really access otherwise. You could technically build full-blown Applescript Objective-C applications, but that is poorly documented and quite a challenge if you don't know what you're doing. But some people have done it, and it works okay. You can also use JavaScript for automation for this. JavaScript for automation is basically the same Applescript functionality, but with a JavaScript interface rather than the native Applescript language, which some people find odd. And because JavaScript is closer to C, on Objective-C, in its implementation, it suits itself a bit better for the Objective-C bridge than the native Applescript. It's kind of gotten a bit of a revival for that. Automator has been in macOS since Tiger. It's used to build simple linear workflows using pre-built actions. And the pre-built actions, the Lego blocks that you can use to build these workflows, they are provided by the developer of the app. And again, Apple, as app developer, is here as well. So the strength or weakness of Automator depends on how well developers provide these actions. And again, modern Apple, not so good in providing these things. Automator exists only on macOS. The new kid in town is Shortcuts. Shortcuts allows you to build linear workflows using pre-built actions. And these actions are provided by the developer of the application that you might want to automate. If that sounds familiar to you, yes, Shortcuts is basically Automator. But the advantage of Shortcuts is it runs on iOS, iPadOS, and macOS. And Shortcuts can be built in a way that they run on all of these platforms. But again, we are really dependent on how the developers implement these pre-built actions. And so far, especially from Apple, surprisingly from Apple, very poor support. Apple spent a lot of time at this developers conference in talking about how you can provide these shortcut actions, and I hope they themselves follow up on this, and then third parties as well. But so far, it's fair to be a bit skeptical about this. Automator is obviously doomed. It will be subsumed by shortcuts. You can import your existing Automator workflows into shortcuts. But whether shortcuts will surpass what Automator could do, I hope so, but we will have to see. So that's it for the built-in automation. Developers and sysadmins like to use Applescript for nice UI stuff. Show up a dialog, show a notification. It's very easy that way. Shell scripting. And until in 2019, that basically meant Bash. But in 2019, we got this. Again, it's the same with the Catalina beta. Apple switched the default shell from Bash to C shell. And when you invoked Bash from the command line, you would get this dialog telling you like the default shell is now Z shell and this is how you switch. So Apple is nudging people, not very gently, to use bash. So is bash gone? Should we all switch to Z shell? Maybe. The answer is a bit more complicated. Z shell has been on macOS since the very beginning, macOS 10, even longer than bash. It wasn't the default shell. Apple switched the default shell to bash with Panther because they wanted to appeal to the Linux crowd, where bash is very popular. But then they froze on bash 3.2, even though bash is now at version 4 and 5. 5.1 is the current version, because bash version 4 and 5 are GPL version 3, which a license which Apple does not like and want to integrate. So because they're frozen on this old version of bash, they have now switched to Z shell, which has a much more friendly license in Apple's view. And that is now the default shell since Catalina, and it is still being frequently updated. In Monterey and Ventura, you will have Z shell 5.8.1, which is the latest version. So bash 3, which is still shipping with Monterey and Ventura, was introduced in Leopard. So it's a 15-year-old binary. And it was last updated in 2013, and it was just a security patch for the shell vulnerability. We're looking at some really old code here, and that's necessarily not a bad thing. It means it's stable, it means it's reliable, but I dread the day where somebody finds another security vulnerability in bash 3. What bash is good at is all those, I call them legacy scripts, but they're really not legacy, all those big scripts in that huge scripting library that is the MacAdmin Slack and Jamf Nation and all of these resources, and Stack Overflow, of course. They usually assume bash 3 on macOS. It is portable. Bash is on every platform, pretty much, including Windows. But keep in mind that on other platforms, they will probably be using bash 5 and not bash 3. So there might be some inconsistencies there. There's another open source tool called shellcheck, which you can use to check your syntax, which is invaluable if you're writing bash scripts. And it comes pre-installed with macOS, albeit the old version, 3.2.57, comes pre-installed. SH is kind of the standard. It's a much more limited feature and syntax set compared to bash or Z shell. But because of that, it is ultimately portable because it's a well-defined standard. And it also works with shellcheck. I can use shellcheck for my SH script. And of course, it comes pre-installed, even though on macOS, SH is handled by bash 3, but macOS 10 or macOS has a way of switching which shell interpreter handles SH, and it can be either dash or Z shell, and by default it's bash. So I think at some time in the future, even before Apple removes the bash 3 binary, they will switch this switch to who interprets SH, and you might need to be aware of that because there are some pitfalls associated with that. And then C shell. C shell has some difference to bash. It's not trivially compatible, especially when you in regards to scripting. It mostly just works. There are a few pitfalls that you need to pay attention to. It is not as ubiquitous as bash, but Z shell exists on all the other platforms as well, so you have the portability. The biggest downside in my eyes is there's no shell check for Z shell, which is really kind of annoying. But it comes pre-installed with macOS 5.8.1 in the most current version. Alternatively, you can install bash 5 even if Apple doesn't pre-install it, and you get the upgrade and get all the nice features of bash 5 and all the latest security patches and everything. It is kind of portable, but you have to switch the shebang on all of your scripts to not use bin bash, but use a local bin bash or wherever you install your bash 5. It works with shellcheck, but it is an additional install. You can install it, you have to manage it, you have to update it. That's what we sysadmins do, but it is an extra work, extra fiction. So the alternative to bash 3, now that Apple has kind of said eventually we probably will not use that anymore. There's unfortunately no simple answer. There's no best solution here, but one of these solutions will fit you best depending on your context and on your needs. shell scripting. Finally, I'd like to talk about Swift. Swift is a new language comparatively. Apple introduced it in 2014, and in the beginning, it was kind of infamous for breaking things every year. Literally, your script or Swift code from the previous year would not work on the update. Things have calmed down since then. In 2019, we got Swift 5 with ABI stability, and even though we've gotten continuous updates twice a year, actually, on Swift, the breaking changes are much, much less, and you can use Swift 5 code up to now, and that's nice. The Swift organization, because Swift is open source, even though Apple is a driving force behind it, it is open source, and they have started talking about Swift 6, which I guess will come late next year or maybe 2024. I don't know for sure. One thing that is new in macOS and very interesting, also introduced in Catalina, was SwiftUI. SwiftUI is a user interface layer for Swift, native in Swift, that layers on top of the other frameworks in macOS. And the idea is that you can use the same user interface language, the same user interface framework, whether you're writing interfaces for watchOS or iOS, iPadOS, up to macOS. And the user interface elements will adapt depending on which platforms they're in, which screen size they're being used in. It is very interesting, very useful, and now in its fourth year with the Ventura release, it's kind of coming to something really useful. And I think it's a bit more accessible and easier for simple UIs than AppKit or UIKit were. So the advantages of Swift, it's the native language for macOS. Apple is pushing this very heavily, and they're making lots of strides towards that. You get system access. As much as a third-party application or tool can get system access, you can get this through the Swift frameworks and the Objective-C and C frameworks, which are bridged into Swift. We can access most of the data we need. Apple is, of course, paying more and more attention to security and privacy, so apps might be sandboxed or need entitlements or be signed or notarized and things like that. And these are very hard to achieve with scripts like Bash or even in Python. It's easier to achieve with Swift or Objective-C apps. The downside of this power is the complexity. There is a steep learning curve with Swift. It's especially when you're coming from shell scripting, there's a lot to process, a lot to learn. It is powerful, but that requires a lot of learning and background. You can run Swift scripts, text files with the Swift shebang, but that requires the dev tools. So for admins, again, pretty useless. As a developer, that might be something for your workflow automation. But as admins, you will most usually deploy a compiled binary, be that a command line tool or an application. So Swift and SwiftUI. I think they should be part of your toolbox, or at least should be aware that what the area is where these are powerful tools. So is the tool set. It hasn't changed much. Some things are a bit different. The thing that has changed most, I guess, since Catalina and before is some of these options are still pre-installed. Z Shell and POSIX are pre-installed in macOS, and the native automation options are pre-installed. Everything else is something that you need to deploy and manage. And again, this is especially relevant for Mac admins. Bash 5, if you want to use it, you have to deploy and manage and update it. Python, definitely bring your own runtime, whether you're building an app in Python or a tool, or want to use it for Mac admin scripts. And when you're building things with Swift and SwiftUI, you probably need to deploy and manage the compiled binary. I have a page which will have the slides and a link to the video when it's up, and links to other talks and articles, not just from me, but from other people about all of these topics. You can find it at scriptingos10.com/MDO22. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I thank Matt for organizing MacDevOpsYVR 2022. I'm so glad I can be back. and all the sponsors for supporting that. And now I'm really looking forward to a good Q&A.